In the late summer and early autumn of 1944, a pivotal Soviet military effort unfolded in the Carpathian Mountains, aiming to drive toward Uzhhorod. This region, occupying a critical juncture between Ukraine, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, had been shaped by shifting allegiances and border realignments in preceding years. The broader framework for this operation was the East Carpathian Strategic Offensive, conducted by the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front beginning in early September 1944. Its explicit objective was to seize key mountain passes, including Dukla, Gumena, and Uzhhorod, and to secure a route into the lowlands beyond the Carpathians. These directives stemmed from Stavka orders dated 28 and 30 July 1944, which tasked Soviet forces with seize and firmly hold the passes through the Carpathian Mountains along the Gumena, Uzhhorod, and Mukachevo axes, with the aim of subsequent entry into the Hungarian plain. At this stage of the war, the Red Army had already achieved substantial strategic advantages. The preceding Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, unfolding from late December 1943 through early May 1944, had pushed German forces out of most of right bank Ukraine and split the Wehrmacht's Army Group South into northern and southern elements. The northern part retreated into Galicia, while the southern portion was forced into Romania. This campaign cost the Soviets approximately 109,528 casualties, including 270,198 killed or missing, and inflicted around 250,956 combat casualties on the Germans. Further to the south, the Uman-Botoshani Offensive, 5 March 17 in April 1944, added to the German collapse. Marshal Ivan Konev's Second Ukrainian Front advanced some 300 kilometers, expelled German forces from southwestern Ukraine, and entered into Romanian and Moldavian territory. Soviet casualties exceeded 121,000 in March and 64,354 in April, while German losses included roughly 300 tanks abandoned or captured near Uman. By late summer 1944, Stavka's attention had turned decisively to the Carpathian region. The Soviets needed to secure mountain passes to facilitate advances into Hungary and Slovakia and to threaten the German Southern Front. In preparation, the Fourth Ukrainian Front, already composed of units seasoned by mountain warfare, such as the 129th Guards Rifle Division, was transferred from Crimea to the Carpathian foothills. By early September, its 107th Rifle Corps, including the 129th, 167th, and 276th Rifle Divisions, began operations aimed at breaking through German defenses in passes like Dukla, moving toward Uzhhorod. Geopolitically, the stakes were high. Capture of Uzhhorod and the broader Transcarpathian region would enable encirclement of German forces in Transylvania and secure the Soviet Union's western flank. At the same time, Czechoslovak-Soviet agreements stipulated that liberated areas of sub-Carpathian Ruthenia would be handed over to provisional Czechoslovak administration once combat operations ended. Soviet intelligence estimated that German resistance would be entrenched but surmountable through coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery operations. Public sentiment within the USSR aligned with the broader momentum of liberation campaigns sweeping westward. This combination of prior strategic successes, layered objectives, and refined planning formed the geopolitical and military groundwork for the Soviet push toward Uzhhorod. The Soviet push toward Uzhhorod began in early September 1944, with coordinated movements across a broad front in the Eastern Carpathians. The Fourth Ukrainian Front, commanded by Army General Ivan Petrov, was tasked with advancing along the mountain approaches toward the Dukla Pass and beyond, aiming to break through Axis defensive lines and reach the Hungarian plain. The German defense was organized under Army Group Heinrici, part of Army Group North Ukraine, which included the 1st Panzer Army and elements of the Hungarian First Army. These forces had prepared fortified lines integrated with natural barriers, taking advantage of the steep ridges, narrow valleys, and forested slopes that defined the terrain. Defensive positions were reinforced with bunkers, trenches, and minefields, supported by artillery and mortars positioned to cover likely avenues of approach. The opening phase began with artillery preparation lasting several hours, designed to disrupt communication lines, destroy fortified positions, and weaken enemy morale before infantry and armor advanced. Soviet rifle divisions moved in coordinated waves, supported by tank brigades adapted for mountain warfare, although the steep gradients and narrow roads limited the use of heavy armor. Air support from the 8th Air Army was concentrated on striking German supply depots and troop concentrations, but low cloud cover and unpredictable weather often curtailed sorties. Initial Soviet gains were modest. In the first week, forces advanced only a few kilometers in some sectors, capturing outlying villages and minor ridges but encountering stubborn resistance. German and Hungarian troops executed delaying tactics, conducting counterattacks that aimed to recapture lost ground and inflict attritional losses. The terrain amplified the defenders' advantage. Narrow passes could be blocked with demolitions, while forested slopes allowed for concealed machine gun nests that were difficult to neutralize without costly frontal assaults. Soviet command sought to maintain pressure along multiple axes to prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces. The main thrust toward Dukla Pass was supported by secondary offensives on parallel routes, including pushes toward Lubkov Pass and along the valleys of the Uzh and Labarek rivers. Coordination between corps was complicated by the mountainous geography, with units often separated by ridges and relying on limited road networks for resupply and reinforcement. Logistical strains emerged early. Supply convoys faced constant harassment from enemy artillery and airstrikes, and the movement of ammunition and food required extensive use of horse-drawn transport in addition to trucks. Despite these challenges, Soviet forces succeeded in establishing several bridgeheads and forward positions close to key passes by mid-September. Casualties on both sides mounted. Soviet losses in the first 2 weeks numbered in the thousands, with some rifle divisions reduced by up to a quarter of their initial strength. German and Hungarian formations also suffered significant attrition, particularly in artillery and anti-tank assets, but remained capable of mounting organized defensive actions. The initial phase revealed the scale of the challenge ahead. The advance into the Carpathians was slower and costlier than Stavka had anticipated, and the defenders' skill in exploiting the terrain made clear that capturing Uzhhorod would require sustained effort, concentrated resources, and careful coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. Strategic planning for the continuation of the Soviet advance toward Uzhhorod evolved in response to the slow progress and heavy fighting of the first weeks. The original Stavka directive had envisioned a relatively rapid penetration through the Dukla and other key passes, followed by a descent into the valleys leading toward Uzhhorod and Mukachevo. Intelligence assessments had underestimated both the depth of German defensive preparations and the speed with which Army Group Heinrici could reinforce threatened sectors. By late September 1944, it became evident that the offensive would require a prolonged and attritional approach, rather than the swift breakthrough initially envisioned. The strategic objectives remained consistent. For the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front, the primary aim was to secure Uzhhorod as a gateway into the Hungarian plain, thus enabling a link-up with Soviet forces advancing from the south through Transylvania. Secondary goals included disrupting German lines of communication between Slovakia and Hungary, forcing the withdrawal of Axis troops from central Slovakia, and opening a corridor for the Czechoslovak First Army Corps to advance into its homeland. The German and Hungarian defenders, aware of these objectives, sought to hold the mountain passes for as long as possible, buying time for the reorganization of defenses deeper in Slovakia and northern Hungary. Logistical considerations played a central role in planning for both sides. The Soviets had to establish and maintain supply lines through rugged, narrow mountain roads, many of which were unsuited to heavy traffic and vulnerable to enemy artillery. Engineering units worked continuously to repair bridges, clear mines, and widen paths for trucks and horse-drawn wagons. In some sectors, aerial supply drops were attempted to support forward units cut off by counterattacks or difficult terrain. Fuel consumption rates for vehicles operating in low gears on steep inclines proved higher than anticipated, further straining resources. The Germans, in turn, relied on an intricate system of pre-prepared depots, concealed ammunition stores, and the use of narrow-gauge rail lines on the Hungarian side of the passes to move reinforcements and supplies closer to the front. Doctrinally, the Soviets attempted to adapt their operational methods to mountain warfare conditions. This included assigning specialized mountain rifle brigades to spearhead assaults on high ground and integrating light artillery that could be dismantled and transported by pack animals. However, the need to coordinate with standard rifle divisions, tank units, and mechanized brigades often led to delays and friction. German doctrine emphasized defensive elasticity, holding key positions until under direct threat, then withdrawing to secondary lines while inflicting maximum casualties through ambushes and interlocking fields of fire. Hungarian units, many of which were familiar with Carpathian terrain, excelled at using small unit actions to disrupt Soviet advances, especially during night operations. Propaganda accompanied the military planning. Soviet communications emphasized the liberation of Czechoslovak and Carpatho-Ukrainian territory, highlighting cooperation with the Czechoslovak First Army Corps to bolster morale among troops and the local population. Leaflets in Ukrainian, Slovak, and Hungarian were distributed to encourage defections and undermine enemy resolve. On the German side, propaganda stressed the defense of the Carpathian fortress as a bulwark against Soviet penetration into Central Europe, portraying the battle as decisive for the fate of Hungary and Slovakia. By early October 1944, both commands recognized that the battle was shifting toward a test of endurance. The Soviets concentrated artillery assets to prepare for coordinated assaults on multiple passes, hoping to stretch the defenders beyond their capacity to respond. German and Hungarian forces continued to rotate frontline units, pulling battered formations back for refitting while deploying fresh reserves to critical points. The stage was set for the first major full-scale engagements that would decide control of the high passes and the road to Uzhhorod. The first large-scale engagements in the Soviet push toward Uzhhorod began in early October 1944, concentrated along the Dukla Pass sector and parallel approaches. Soviet forces committed to the main effort included the 38th Army under Colonel General Kirill Moskalenko, supported by the Czechoslovak 1st Army Corps, commanded by General Ludvík Svoboda. Against them stood elements of the German 1st Panzer Army, including the 1st Mountain Division, 97th Jaeger Division, and parts of the 357th Infantry Division, reinforced by the Hungarian 1st Mountain Brigade and other Hungarian infantry formations. These units had prepared their defenses with overlapping fields of fire, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and extensive use of natural rock outcroppings as fortified positions. The Soviet opening moves involved sustained artillery barrages intended to neutralize key defensive nodes and disrupt command posts. In the Dukla Pass sector alone, several hundred guns and mortars concentrated their fire on a narrow front, targeting known bunker complexes and suspected observation posts. Infantry assaults followed in waves, with Czechoslovak units often advancing alongside Soviet rifle divisions to seize ridgelines dominating the pass. However, progress was immediately hindered by well-concealed machine gun positions and minefields laid across the only viable approach routes. In the first week of heavy fighting, the Soviets captured a number of forward enemy positions, but paid a high cost in manpower. Some battalions reported losses exceeding 40% after attempting to storm fortified slopes under concentrated artillery and mortar fire. German and Hungarian defenders frequently counterattacked, using the cover of dense forests to infiltrate flanks and recapture lost trenches. These actions forced Soviet units to commit reserves earlier than planned, limiting their ability to exploit breakthroughs. Further south, advances along the Uzh River Valley met similar resistance. Narrow roads, steep banks, and the constant threat of landslides or destroyed bridges slowed the movement of supplies and artillery. In several instances, Soviet forward units became temporarily isolated when German engineers demolished bridges behind retreating forces, compelling Soviet sappers to conduct emergency repairs under fire. Coordination with armored units was challenging. Tanks and self-propelled guns could not easily maneuver through the winding mountain paths, and those that did reach the front were often restricted to supporting infantry in direct fire roles against pillboxes and fortified buildings. The fighting in early October revealed that Axis forces were determined to defend every ridge and village. Villages such as Kapishova, Svidnik, and Nizhna Pisana became focal points for repeated assaults and counter-assaults, with control sometimes changing hands multiple times in a single day. The destruction of infrastructure was extensive. Many settlements were reduced to rubble. Wells were deliberately contaminated, and farmland was mined to slow advancing troops. Civilians who had not evacuated were caught in the crossfire, with casualties mounting despite efforts by both sides to move non-combatants away from the immediate front. Weather compounded the difficulties. Heavy autumn rains turned dirt roads into mud, reducing supply vehicle speeds to a crawl and sometimes immobilizing them entirely. Visibility in the fog-covered mountain passes was frequently reduced to a few dozen meters, limiting the effectiveness of artillery spotting and aerial reconnaissance. Aircraft from the Soviet 8th Air Army flew fewer sorties than planned due to the persistent low cloud ceiling, though they managed some successful strikes on German supply convoys moving along the Hungarian side of the border. By mid-October, the Soviets had made incremental progress toward key passes, but had not achieved a decisive breakthrough. The Axis defense lines, though battered, remained intact, forcing Soviet commanders to consider deeper flanking maneuvers and more concentrated attacks to break the deadlock. The battle was settling into a prolonged and costly contest for control of the Carpathian approaches, with both sides committing reinforcements to prevent collapse at critical points. The first engagements had proven that the route to Uzhhorod would be won only through sustained methodical pressure in the face of formidable resistance. As the battle for the Carpathian passes intensified in the second half of October 1944, the fighting entered a phase of escalation that drew in additional forces, resources, and political attention. Soviet Stavka, aware that the original timetable for capturing Uzhhorod had slipped considerably, ordered the 4th Ukrainian Front to concentrate its efforts on breaking the Dukla axis and advancing toward the Hungarian border before winter weather made large-scale operations in the mountains impossible. Reinforcements were brought forward, including fresh rifle divisions and artillery regiments from reserve formations, while existing units received replacements to offset the attrition suffered in the first weeks. On the Axis side, Army Group Heinrizi shifted additional German mountain and infantry battalions to the front, supported by Hungarian formations familiar with the terrain, in an effort to hold the high ground at all costs. The terrain continued to play a decisive role in the operational tempo. The steep ridges and deep valleys favored defensive tactics, allowing smaller Axis forces to delay larger Soviet units by blocking narrow passes or holding isolated hilltops. German artillery observers stationed on high vantage points could direct accurate fire onto Soviet assembly areas and approach routes, inflicting heavy casualties before assaults could even begin. The Soviets responded by increasing the use of night attacks, aiming to close the distance to enemy positions under cover of darkness, though such operations were complicated by the difficulty of navigation in unfamiliar terrain. The reinforcement phase also saw a marked increase in the scale of artillery duels. Soviet heavy guns, including 152 mm howitzers, were positioned on ridges within range of German strongpoints, while the Axis defenders relied on well-camouflaged field pieces and mortars. Ammunition expenditure rose sharply. Some Soviet artillery units fired hundreds of shells per day during preparatory bombardments. Supply lines, already strained, were pushed to their limits, with mule trains, horse-drawn wagons, and teams of soldiers carrying crates of ammunition up narrow, muddy trails to the gun positions. Weather conditions further complicated operations. Heavy rains in late October caused rivers and streams to swell, washing out temporary bridges and delaying the movement of artillery and supply convoys. Mudslides blocked some mountain roads entirely, forcing engineering units to cut new tracks along precarious slopes. The constant dampness also led to an increase in illness among soldiers, with cases of trench foot, pneumonia, and other exposure-related ailments reported in both Soviet and Axis ranks. Medical units struggled to evacuate the wounded from forward positions due to the lack of reliable vehicle access, often relying on stretcher teams and pack animals. The political dimension of the battle grew as the Soviet advance slowed. Moscow pressed for faster results to coordinate with the ongoing operations in Hungary and to fulfill commitments to the Czechoslovak government in exile regarding the liberation of Slovak and Carpatho-Ukrainian territory. In Berlin and Budapest, the High Command emphasized the importance of holding the Carpathian Line to protect the Hungarian plain and maintain a defensive buffer against the advancing Red Army. German propaganda highlighted the mountain front as a symbol of resistance, while Hungarian media portrayed the defense as vital for the survival of the nation. Civilian impact during this period was severe. Villages caught in the contested zones faced repeated shelling, requisitioning of food and livestock, and forced labor to repair roads or fortifications. Displaced persons moved through the valleys in search of safety, often under fire. Some local inhabitants assisted Soviet troops as guides or by providing intelligence on enemy positions, while others, fearing reprisals, attempted to remain neutral or aided Axis forces in the hope of preserving their homes. By the end of October, the scale of casualties reflected the intensifying struggle. Soviet divisions often reported several hundred losses in a single day of heavy fighting, while German and Hungarian units experienced similar rates when defending positions under concentrated bombardment. Yet, despite these losses, the front lines shifted only gradually, with both sides preparing for even greater commitments of men and material as the campaign reached its peak. The stage was set for some of the most intense and sustained battles of the Carpathian Offensive. The peak of the Carpathian campaign toward Uzhhorod came in late October and early November 1944, when Soviet forces launched their most concentrated assaults along the Dukla axis and supporting approaches. The 38th Army, working in close coordination with the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, committed multiple rifle divisions to simultaneous attacks on the dominant heights and fortified villages guarding the main road to the pass. These actions were supported by massed artillery and mortar fire, as well as limited air support from the 8th Air Army during brief periods of clear weather. Soviet commanders aimed to overwhelm the Axis defense through sheer density of fire and coordinated infantry pressure, exploiting any breach before German and Hungarian reserves could react. One of the central engagements during this phase occurred around the village of Kapishova, where German forces had entrenched themselves in a defensive system anchored by concrete bunkers, interlinked trenches, and concealed firing positions on the slopes above the main road. The Soviet 305th Rifle Division, supported by Czechoslovak infantry, attacked repeatedly over several days. Artillery barrages leveled much of the village, but the defenders held on through counterattacks and accurate mortar fire. Only after sustained fighting that cost both sides hundreds of casualties was the position finally abandoned by German troops, who withdrew to secondary lines deeper in the pass. Elsewhere, battles for high ground such as Hill 534 and Hill 701 became prolonged contests in their own right. Control of these heights was critical for artillery observation and for dominating the surrounding valleys. Soviet units often assaulted these positions multiple times in a single week, with gains measured in tens of meters. German mountain troops, trained for such terrain, counterattacked swiftly to retake lost ground, forcing Soviet commanders to commit reserves to hold newly captured objectives. The constant back and forth over these ridges consumed significant manpower and ammunition without producing a decisive breakthrough. The intensity of operations during this period strained both armies to their limits. Soviet artillery units reported ammunition shortages despite the heavy logistical effort to resupply them. Axis forces, meanwhile, were increasingly dependent on supplies brought in from the Hungarian plain via vulnerable mountain roads, which were targeted by Soviet air attacks whenever weather permitted. Fuel shortages began to limit German and Hungarian motorized movements, forcing greater reliance on horse-drawn transport and slowing the ability to reinforce threatened sectors. Civilian suffering reached its height during this phase of the campaign. Villages near the front were often completely destroyed by bombardment, and surviving residents were evacuated, sometimes forcibly, by either side to clear the area for military use. Local infrastructure, including rail lines and bridges, was systematically demolished to deny the enemy rapid movement. The destruction extended beyond immediate combat zones as both Soviet and Axis units targeted transportation hubs and depots deeper in enemy-controlled territory to disrupt the flow of reinforcements. Weather again played a decisive role. Cold rains gave way to early snowfalls in the higher elevations, further complicating the movement of vehicles and artillery. Ice formed on steep mountain tracks, making them hazardous for both wheeled and pack transport. Units that had already endured weeks of fighting now faced exposure to freezing temperatures with inadequate shelter in many forward positions. Frostbite cases began to appear alongside combat injuries, adding to the burden on already overstretched medical services. By early November, the Soviet Fourth Ukrainian Front had advanced into the outer defenses of Uzhhorod's approaches, but had yet to achieve full operational penetration through all major passes. The Axis defenders, though increasingly worn down, continued to contest every kilometer. The fighting had reached a level of intensity where both sides were locked in a struggle of attrition, each hoping that the other would reach the limits of endurance first. The next phase of the battle would see adaptations in tactics, as each side sought to break the deadlock before the onset of deep winter. As November 1944 progressed, both Soviet and Axis forces adjusted their tactics in an effort to sustain operations under deteriorating conditions. For the Soviets, the need to maintain offensive momentum before the onset of full winter was paramount. Commanders of the Fourth Ukrainian Front restructured their assault patterns, favoring shorter, concentrated attacks aimed at seizing one or two key objectives at a time, rather than attempting broad advances along the entire front. This allowed artillery and air support to be focused more effectively, and reduced the strain on logistics, which had become increasingly difficult as snow and ice began to cover the mountain roads. One adaptation was the expanded use of specialized mountain rifle units, which were more mobile in the rugged terrain and less dependent on heavy vehicles. These formations operated in smaller groups, advancing along ridges or through forested slopes to outflank enemy positions. They were supported by light mortars and machine guns that could be disassembled and carried by pack animals. In certain sectors, Soviet units coordinated with Czechoslovak troops familiar with local geography, using their knowledge to identify paths and defiles that bypassed heavily defended routes. The Axis forces likewise adapted, making use of their defensive advantage in the high ground. German and Hungarian commanders increasingly relied on well-planned withdrawal and counterattack tactics, pulling back from positions under heavy pressure and then striking at overextended Soviet units. In several instances, small German detachments managed to cut Soviet supply lines or capture isolated forward positions by exploiting gaps created during the reorganization of assault formations. These actions slowed the Soviet advance and forced the Fourth Ukrainian Front to keep significant reserves in readiness to guard against infiltration. The logistical challenge grew more acute on both sides. Soviet supply convoys moved slowly through the snow-covered passes, with horse-drawn sledges supplementing truck transport. Ammunition shortages remained a persistent issue, particularly for artillery units. German and Hungarian forces faced their own difficulties as Soviet artillery and aircraft targeted the narrow mountain roads leading from the Hungarian plain, destroying bridges and blocking routes with landslides triggered by shelling. Fuel shortages were increasingly severe for the defenders, limiting their ability to move reserves quickly to threatened points. In the rear areas, partisan activity also influenced the conduct of the campaign. Soviet-aligned resistance groups in the Carpathians, though limited in size, conducted reconnaissance, sabotaged communications, and provided guides for advancing units. The Germans responded with sweeps through suspected partisan zones, diverting manpower from the front, but ensuring that their supply routes remained usable. The complex terrain made these anti-partisan operations slow and manpower-intensive. The psychological toll of the campaign became evident during this stage. Units on both sides had endured continuous combat for weeks, in harsh mountain conditions, with limited rest and exposure to cold and damp. Morale fluctuated depending on local successes or failures. Soviet propaganda emphasized the liberation of Carpatho-Ukraine and the approach toward Hungary, while Axis messaging stressed the importance of defending Central Europe from Soviet occupation. In some Hungarian units, the prolonged fighting in difficult terrain led to growing war weariness, particularly among reservists. By the third week of November, Soviet forces had secured several additional ridgelines and approaches to Uzhhorod, placing them within striking distance of the city's outer defenses. However, the main Axis defensive belt in the region remained intact, anchored on fortified positions that had been prepared months in advance. Both sides understood that any decisive breakthrough at this stage would require concentrated force and precise timing. For the Soviets, this meant preparing for one final push before winter halted large-scale operations. For the Germans and Hungarians, it meant holding until the season's weather gave them a natural advantage in slowing the offensive. The campaign was entering a phase where endurance, adaptation, and control of the few passable routes would determine its outcome. The turning point of the Soviet push toward Uzhhorod came in the final days of November 1944, when the Fourth Ukrainian Front concentrated its strength for a coordinated assault along the main Uzh Valley axis. Intelligence indicated that the German 1st Mountain Division and elements of the Hungarian 1st Army had thinned their lines in certain sectors to reinforce positions farther west, creating an opportunity to exploit reduced defensive density. Stavka authorized the redeployment of additional artillery regiments and a concentrated grouping of rifle divisions to press the attack before winter conditions made further progress impossible. The offensive began with a massive artillery preparation on 26 November. Over several hours, Soviet guns and mortars pounded identified strongpoints, supply dumps, and suspected command posts. The bombardment was accompanied by targeted airstrikes from the 8th Air Army, which, taking advantage of a rare break in the weather, hit transport nodes on the Hungarian side of the border to disrupt reinforcements. Soviet infantry advanced immediately after the barrage, supported by self-propelled guns positioned on roads and clearings where the terrain allowed. One of the key engagements occurred near the village of Solomonovo, east of Uzhhorod. Here, the Soviet 320th Rifle Division broke through the first line of German defenses, capturing a series of interconnected trenches and bunkers after close-quarter fighting. The defenders responded with counterattacks, deploying small groups of mountain troops to exploit gaps in Soviet formations. However, Soviet commanders committed fresh battalions to stabilize the line and continue the advance. By nightfall, the attackers had secured several kilometers of the Uzh Valley Road, bringing them significantly closer to the city. In parallel, Soviet units in the southern sector advanced toward Mukachevo, aiming to outflank Uzhhorod from the south and cut Axis withdrawal routes. This movement forced the Germans and Hungarians to divert reserves from the main defensive belt around Uzhhorod, weakening their capacity to hold the entire front. The Axis command recognized the risk of encirclement, but faced difficulties in executing a coordinated withdrawal due to damaged infrastructure, destroyed bridges, and constant harassment from Soviet artillery. The human cost of the turning point battles was high. Soviet casualty reports for the last week of November numbered in the thousands, with individual rifle regiments suffering over 200 killed and wounded in single-day assaults. Axis losses were similarly severe, compounded by the capture of prisoners when Soviet breakthroughs isolated forward positions. Medical facilities on both sides were overwhelmed, and the evacuation of wounded under snow and freezing rain slowed further due to impassable mountain tracks. The changing tactical situation was reinforced by the weather itself. Snow now covered most of the high passes, restricting mobility and making it nearly impossible to conduct large-scale counteroffensives. Soviet troops, operating in better supplied sectors, were able to rotate front-line units and deliver concentrated blows at selected points. German and Hungarian forces, however, had to stretch their manpower thin over an extended front, unable to respond with the same intensity to each Soviet attack. By the end of November, the Soviet 4th Ukrainian Front had achieved a partial breakthrough into the outer defensive zone of Uzhhorod. The Axis position was becoming untenable, with supply lines threatened and flanks under pressure. While the defenders still held key strongpoints, their capacity to launch major counterattacks was diminishing rapidly. The strategic momentum had shifted decisively toward the Soviets, setting the stage for the final phase of the operation, that would determine control of the city and the surrounding region. Combat operations in early December 1944 marked the beginning of the final stage of the Soviet drive on Uzhhorod. Following the partial breakthrough in late November, the Fourth Ukrainian Front shifted its focus to systematically dismantling the remaining Axis defensive network around the city. The advance proceeded along two main axes, the Uzh Valley from the east and the lowland approach from the southeast via Mukachevo. Coordination between these thrusts aimed to encircle Uzhhorod and cut all remaining lines of retreat into Slovakia and Hungary. The Soviet 320th and 351st Rifle Divisions advanced along the valley floor, clearing villages and fortified positions in sequence. Each position taken was immediately consolidated to guard against counterattack. German and Hungarian defenders, now heavily outnumbered and low on ammunition, relied on delay-in tactics, blowing bridges, mining crossroads, and using mobile artillery to disrupt Soviet concentrations before withdrawing. Despite these efforts, the attackers maintained steady pressure, rotating battalions to keep fresh troops in the assault. To the south, Soviet units pushing from Mukachevo faced determined resistance from elements of the Hungarian First Army, reinforced by remnants of German infantry divisions pulled from other sectors. Here, the fighting often took place in open lowland terrain, where the defenders could deploy anti-tank guns effectively. Soviet armor support was stronger on this axis than in the mountains, allowing for more rapid advances when enemy lines were breached. Coordinated infantry armor assaults enabled the capture of several key road junctions, gradually tightening the encirclement. Civilian areas bore the brunt of the closing battles. Villages on the approaches to Uzhhorod were subjected to heavy shelling as both sides sought to deny their use as defensive strongpoints. Many residents had already fled earlier in the campaign, but those remaining endured bombardment, shortages of food, and the destruction of homes and infrastructure. Soviet field kitchens and medical detachments attempted to provide limited aid to civilians in newly captured areas, though the priority remained on sustaining the combat units. Axis defensive cohesion began to erode under the combined strain of combat losses, logistical collapse, and worsening weather. Snowfall increased in frequency and depth, making vehicle movement difficult and further slowing the transport of supplies from the Hungarian plain. German and Hungarian commanders recognized that holding Uzhhorod was becoming untenable but sought to delay Soviet capture as long as possible to facilitate an orderly withdrawal of remaining forces toward the west. Soviet artillery played a decisive role in this phase. Batteries were moved forward to newly secured high ground, allowing for more accurate shelling of Uzhhorod's outer defenses and supply routes. The constant bombardment reduced the ability of the defenders to maneuver and forced them into static positions that were increasingly vulnerable to encirclement. Soviet reconnaissance patrols identified weak points and gaps in the defensive line, directing concentrated infantry attacks to exploit them. By mid-December, Soviet spearheads from both the Uzh Valley and Mukachevo directions were within a few kilometers of the city limits. Axis resistance had been reduced to isolated pockets, each fighting independently as communications broke down. The prospect of a full encirclement was imminent, and German and Hungarian units prepared for either withdrawal under cover of darkness or last-ditch defense within the urban perimeter. The battle for Uzhhorod was entering its decisive moment, with both sides aware that the coming days would determine control of the city and the conclusion of the Carpathian campaign. The final assault on Uzhhorod unfolded in the closing days of December 1944, as the 4th Ukrainian Front executed a coordinated offensive from the east, southeast, and north to eliminate the remaining Axis presence in the city and its surroundings. Soviet forces advancing along the Uzh Valley moved into the outer suburbs under cover of concentrated artillery fire, which targeted known defensive positions, intersections, and suspected command centers. Simultaneously, the formations approaching from Mukachevo closed the southern approaches, cutting the last viable withdrawal route toward Hungary. The operation's objective was to secure Uzhhorod rapidly to prevent the defenders from establishing a prolonged urban defense. The German and Hungarian forces in the city were reduced to a composite garrison made up of depleted infantry battalions, local security units, and small armored detachments. Their positions included fortified buildings, barricaded streets, and pre-sighted machine gun nests covering main thoroughfares. Despite shortages of ammunition and supplies, these units fought to delay the Soviet entry long enough to allow portions of their forces to retreat westward. Street fighting began almost immediately upon the Soviet vanguard entering the built-up areas, with small unit engagements taking place in courtyards, warehouses, and railway yards. Soviet tactics emphasized bypassing strongpoints when possible to avoid unnecessary delays. Assault groups, supported by engineers, cleared barricades and disarmed mines, while rifle companies secured key infrastructure such as the railway station, river bridges, and road junctions. In several cases, defenders attempted to demolish bridges to slow the advance, but Soviet engineering detachments managed to secure and repair them quickly, ensuring the uninterrupted movement of reinforcements and supplies into the city. Fighting within Uzhhorod lasted for several days, marked by intense exchanges in the industrial districts and around the central administrative buildings. The defenders launched multiple counterattacks, often at night, to disrupt Soviet consolidation of captured areas. However, the attrition of previous weeks, combined with the lack of heavy weaponry, meant these efforts could not significantly alter the course of the battle. By 27 to 28 December, Soviet units had secured most of the city, forcing the remaining Axis troops to retreat toward the Slovak border under cover of darkness and worsening winter weather. The capture of Uzhhorod marked the effective conclusion of the Soviet Carpathian offensive in this sector. The city's fall opened the way into eastern Slovakia and provided a secure base for subsequent operations aimed at clearing the remaining German forces from the region. The immediate aftermath saw the Soviets consolidating control, establishing supply depots, and repairing key transport links to support ongoing campaigns in Central Europe. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps, which had fought alongside the Soviets, began preparations for operations deeper into Slovak territory, fulfilling part of the political commitments made earlier in the year. For the German and Hungarian forces, the loss of Uzhhorod represented both a tactical defeat and a strategic setback. It deprived them of a critical defensive anchor in the Carpathians and exposed their positions in Slovakia and northern Hungary to Soviet advances. Withdrawal from the city was conducted in haste, with many units abandoning heavy equipment and supplies that could not be evacuated over the snow-covered passes. In military terms, the battle demonstrated the challenges of sustained offensive operations in mountainous and winter conditions, as well as the limitations of static defenses once supply lines were compromised. Soviet success was achieved through a combination of persistence, adaptation to terrain, and the gradual attrition of enemy forces. In political terms, the operation strengthened Soviet influence in post-war Czechoslovakia and cemented control over Transcarpathian Ukraine. The liberation of Uzhhorod thus stood as both a military milestone and a precursor to the final offensives that would carry the Red Army into the heart of Central Europe in 1945.